would do is try and tease out a couple of themes. I mean, there are 2 or 3 themes you can work on, but I want to leave some time for audience participation. So we'll pace it. But the first thing I want to talk to is something which a couple of the speakers mentioned. I think Mr. Chaudhary, Binod, you talked about how the whole South Asian thing just hasn't been able to come together. It's actually quite constructive that the total trade among the South Asian nations, SAARC, this thing is about 1 or 2% of GDP. You look at ASEAN, that number is about 10% of GDP. Right? So I want to start with trying to tease out what is it that we can do to try and create better integration within the South Asian countries at a business level. I have a thesis which says that if you rely purely on government-to-government exchange, you talked about, Modi will go and shake Nawaz Sharif's hand, and that's. But the reality, if you think about ASEAN, you think about many other economic unions, the large part of the heavy lifting has actually been done by the private sector. So what do we need to do to get more private sector cross-country engagement? Mr. Khan, you talked about working with Airtel, working with Tata. Why do we not have more of this? Why does Bangladesh or why does Nepal have to go to Pakistan through Singapore? And what can we collectively do to try and create a situation where there is greater dialogue, participation, and even trust to make some of this cross-country thing happen, particularly the smaller country, but also India. We all know the challenges and the tensions dealing with India, with the smaller countries, the trade issues. What does the private sector need to do differently to be able to lead? They're asking Mr. Kumar, is there even a SAARC business forum? He said there is, but I don't know who runs it. So is there an opportunity for us to do something differently? And why don't we start with you, since you started in the morning, and then maybe we take you and Aziz first, and then maybe a couple of people on this side.
First thing that I would like to categorically reiterate that there is no issue when it comes to people relationship. I found that a Pakistani and an Indian are the best of the friends when they meet outside.
Outside Pakistan and
India?
India?
Outside and India. It's a fact. Of course, we are also best of the friends in Pakistan and India too. That's a different story. Because there is no space for politics there. Okay, we are businessmen, or we may be from other walks of life. So I think the whole issue, as I mentioned, that one has been deeply involved through the formative days of the SAARC chamber. One has seen, because we've successfully ran our own respective chambers, CII, equivalent, CNI, FICCI, FNCCI. But when it comes to SAARC chamber, it doesn't work. Because I think the basic mandate of the SAARC is fractured. Okay? That you cannot do anything unless there is a consensus, and consensus never takes place. And at the end of the day, it's the policy. The free flow of goods and services is dictated by the policies of respective government. You can't do much. I don't think there has been any lack of lobbying, convincing, presenting sound justifications and rationales of why it needs to be done. But I think politics hinges there. Having said that, I think there are many sectors where even the let's say the traditional, conventional constraints cannot contain them. Okay? Technology, once again, we're talking about. I don't think there is any. I think we need more strong, more vibrant forums like this for the businessmen to come together. It doesn't have to be always on an institutional basis. It should be more on a businessman to businessman basis, supported by bankers probably, to identify areas where we can work together. And if let's say the true answer lies in growing influence of businessmen in the respective countries as well as in the region as a whole. I don't find, recently I was talking to Economic Times, they have their annual event, as you know, the business summit, etc. I asked them, why don't you have a South Asian session here? Why don't you try to identify how many businessmen within the SAARC who also deal, apart from India, with the other countries in the region, and vice versa. The picture that you will come across will be very dismal. So I think you're absolutely right. We need to work on both sides. I think SAARC will have to someday change its mandate. It has to be, if there is a dissent by one country, they'll have to choose to stay away.
Yeah. So I guess the question is, how can businessmen create a forum of their own? And Aziz, you had some good experiences, you said, with some Indian companies working in the region. What makes it work sometimes and not work other times?
Thank you very much. In my view, the challenge comes from the multiculturalism and multi-religion that we have in the subcontinent in South Asia that creates a conflicting situation of distrust. We must remove the distrust. So what we need to do is go above this multicultural, multi-religious facet and think how to grow economically, how to provide wealth to the people of the country. If our politicians and thought leaders would start thinking that how to improve the quality of life, then it would be solved. And that can be done by the private sector. Because free market economy provides an enabling environment for everybody to work together and improve the quality of life of all the people, as Mr. Vinod was saying earlier. So I personally feel that we must allow private sector to get its appropriate position in the governance of a country as well. Today, there is almost a difference between politics and business, a huge difference between those two. There must be some amount of porosity so that the enabling abilities of the private sector infuses into the government.
So I guess, Mr. Kumar, what do you think? This morning, I was struck, Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe talked about Sri Lanka and the 5 southern Indian states, right, being able to hopefully create some kind of zone. Now, that potentially transcends the issues of religion, etc. you talked about. Is there a potential for subgroupings of businessmen to come together, and could that have more traction?
I think what Prime Minister said this morning is very correct, and I agree with what Binod says. I think government is an enabling area. I think, globalization, Infosys went to the US not because government asked it to go, because there's business happening. I think where he said correctly, I think businessmen need to get together to participate and work in this area. I think the subgroupings is only to make neighboring areas work faster. He's talking about the 9 ports, because 9 ports can be connected very easily. And I think while it's difficult to get porosity in government, because in India especially and other countries also, but
I know why you say that. Government is a business
government
in India.
is a business. No, but I think to a large extent government is starting to learn, because I think unless they listen to business, they're going to be hurt in the long run. I think this is happening. Unfortunately, it's taking too long a time. I think the first time when we had the crisis, government listened to business in 91 and changed a lot. I think the second range of reforms in India are taking a lot more time. But coming back to what you're saying, I think business to business relationship is what will bring globalization. And I think, I'm not saying banks, it could be chambers. I think we need to bring forays together to make this happen.
So maybe that would be a good takeaway from this panel. If you're leading businessmen in Bangladesh, Nepal, India, CII, if we could put together a South Asia Business Forum which has a platform for people to engage more actively, and maybe banks can help, that might be a good takeaway to move this needle somewhat.
I just want to add one more thing. Sorry, go ahead, sir.
Go ahead, Shahzad, you're saying?
Yeah, that's a good starting point, actually, setting up. That's why I proposed that maybe set up a secretariat and a business council here in Singapore, because it somehow seems to work better when it's outside the region itself. So Singapore is probably the best place.
Agree.
I was just saying that, in terms of global, we as a company have gone to Egypt. I mean, there's no reason why there's no political reason or political help to go to Egypt, because we found the raw materials there and we went there to do a manufacturing product. So therefore, I think business will find the best way and the most profitable way to go. But I think a catalyst, as the seminar also, the convention suggests, I think we need to be a catalyst, and Singapore could be a catalyst.
So I think that's my net. Because effectively, think about the flow of capital and business. It really tends to follow economic rationale.
Yeah.
Except when it comes to South Asia, there are other elements of a trust deficit, religion, race, etc., which tend to come and color the equation. I think that's the first thing. The private sector in particular has the capacity to be able to cut through that and be able to create something. And I think the time is right. The private sector today is beginning to get a voice, which is different, and technology is helping to be able to get this thing. The second thing I wanted to touch on, tease out perhaps. You talked at length about CI influencing government policy, and Vinod just talked about the fact that it's finally down to government policy and what can you do with government policy. And I have two things I want to throw open to, in fact, to everybody. Actually, you talked a lot about it, Ravi, about how you were able to work with the government to do some stuff. Now, we're not naive. We all know governments are extremely important and policy frameworks are extremely important in being able to drive some change and change in the agenda. However, the question I have is to, one, what is the capacity in each of your countries today to be able to influence that policy framework, or for the private sector to actually be able to push the boundaries relative to what has been possible in the past? This question one, to be able to do this thing. And second, what is the nature of the policies themselves? So PPP arrangements, again, you talked about a PPP, this thing. PPP arrangements, the ability to work with governments through administration, where private sector can rely on the government as a true partner and be able to therefore invest for the long term. Are those things which are realistic in the South Asian context today? And is that something that you think has potential? And so why don't we start with the speakers who haven't spoken so far? Mano, you want to start and then?
Yeah, well, we are in a very interesting spot. We are not an Indian company, we are a Singapore company, but we got a huge stake in India. And interestingly, many of our projects are actually in cooperation with the Indian government. So I gave the example of Bangalore. Our Bangalore project is a joint venture with the Karnataka state government. Our Chennai project is also a cooperation with an agency of the Tamil Nadu government. Our project in Pune is a joint venture with the government of Maharashtra. And our experience so far, there are obviously challenges, but on the whole, it has been a positive experience. And I think the reason for this is because our interests are aligned. We do not go into a location until and unless we are fully convinced that our interests are aligned with the local government. I mentioned earlier that we are not short-term investors. We do not just go in, develop a property, sell it off, and leave. We stay there for the long term. We help create value for the location where we are in, and creating value means creating jobs. And this fundamental philosophy of creating good jobs in the location where we are in really aligns our interests tremendously. So while there are hiccups, the hiccups are more related to certain issues and processes, but the long-term interest is aligned. And this example that I gave of our experience in India is actually no different from what we have in other countries, including China. In China, we are developing a township with the Guangzhou government, Guangzhou Knowledge City. It's a huge project. It's going to be a 30-year project probably over all the phases. But again, because our interests are aligned, we are able to overcome these challenges. So I say my advice, as obvious as it sounds, is really to have aligned interests. If your interests are really aligned, then you will be able to overcome these challenges. So overall, I think our experience has been positive.
Shehzad, what do you think? You're working in several countries. You talk about investing in infrastructure in the region.
Right.
A large number of infrastructure investment requires supported government policy and multi-year, multi-generation.
Absolutely.
What's your experience and what do you think?
Look, I think most of these countries actually, the biggest hurdle is the lack of enabling environment and conducive policies that support infrastructure investment, because these projects are all long-term. So unless you are sure of what's going to happen in the next 10, 15 years, you wouldn't really dare to invest money into those projects. So the continuity of policies becomes a fundamental decision-making point. So unless the government's going to assure the investors that, look guys, come what may, policies will stay, and make them comfortable with that, I think it's hard to fund these projects. So the key to unlocking this is creating the investors' confidence with the right enabling policies.
You the Malaysian government had a lot of confidence in you, Ravi, you said repeatedly. How did you manage to get that?
Well, I think it's not about just having confidence in me. Maybe I just want to go back to your question, your point that you're trying to make. You know, governments all over in the region are going through difficult times. Petronas used to be the biggest contributor to the Malaysian economy. I think we get half the contribution now from what we used to get. So there's a big deficit that's happening. So the Malaysian government, I think, is just not talking about supporting me, and I don't represent the Malaysian government. Let me declare this. I'm just an entrepreneur, in private business. But what I'm trying to say is the government is now listening. The government is listening to the private sector. There's a need for them to work with the private sector to make things happen. So this is why the PPP model, PPP has got definitions in different countries, different definitions, but I think in Malaysia, the clear definition, the straightforward definition is public-private sector. And I think the government is now, very open to this PPP methodology, and that's really helping. Because, a country like Malaysia, we're building 2 MRT lines, we're building the 3rd LRT line, so there's a lot of money that's required. So we are now coming with new propositions with the government, and the government is willing to listen. They're very open to doing a deal with the private sector, which wasn't the case maybe 10, 15 years ago. And then talking about working with other countries, I think I agree that the private sector should work, like we have the CEOs Forum with the Indian counterparts. So we now work, the Malaysian Indian Business Council, for example, the MIBC works with the CEOs Forum, the CEOs in India. We have the CEO Forum. We try and work with them and just try and get the government so that we can make things happen. Because if you depend on the government to make everything happen, it's a no-starter. Yeah. So I think this is what we're trying to do. So on one side, we get the government to try and listen to your PPP proposals, and if they are open to that, then going outside Malaysia, we get the government to facilitate, while we actually, the private sector is driving it. Right. And I think that's the only way to make this happen, and that same formula could be used across South Asia as well, I would think so. Yeah.
That's a great observation. All right, questions from the floor. The mics are there. Yes, please, can you move up to the mic, and can you make it a tight question?
Good afternoon to one and all present here. My name is Himasai Katumuri. I'm from Global Indian International School. Sir, we often talk about preserving our values and cultures, something that's been passed on to us from our parents and our ancestors. And in the business world, we talk about digitalization and where it's taken the business world now with all the developments and changes. So as entrepreneurs, or rather future entrepreneurs, what is something that we students should look forward to preserve with ourselves when it comes to business?
That's a great question. So let me actually put a little spin on your question, if you don't mind, because this is the third theme I wanted to tease out. All of you talked in very philanthropic terms, but the role of business should be to do other things, not just business and so on. And goes back to this whole sense of stakeholders versus shareholders or giving back. Right? Linked to that question, if you think about the values you need to take and carry forward with you as you drive this thing, what kind of values do they need to be that allows you to marry shareholder interests with other broader interests? Should we just run through this thing, Mr. Khan?
This is off the cuff, but I think the most important value for every human being is integrity. The integrity to the works that he is doing, to the student who has just spoken today, as he would require to study. When you were doing business, you would require to do business for the sake of doing good business, not for the sake of making money, not for giving away or not for taking away. Do good business, love your business, and you will succeed. And that would come from the integrity of mind. You must not think about cheating, either at school or at while you were in the
love
in
your
the
business and integrity.
Right.
Vinod, yours.
Well, we need to remember that today the world is absolutely transparent. Okay, there is no way you'll be able to hide any of what you do, what you think. And secondly, to access information has become so easy. Earlier, one would make 5 calls before you have a meeting. Today, you just Google the fellow, you go just before you go to the meeting, and nothing gets hidden. Thirdly, times have come when you are going to be respected if you deliver your promise. If you're a businessman, your product, your service, your value system of the organization, your engagement with your stakeholders, you got to be a company that people admire. There are plenty of companies all over the world. They're all competing for that space. I guess that's what is the
Deliver your promise. You'll be admired after that. Ravi?
Absolutely. I think integrity, of course, commitment, deliver again, and I think values. You spoke about values. I think values are that you pick up at home when you're a child. Those values are important. How you look at your business, how you run the business, and deep down there, you must have this value. What your parents would have taught you, which is important. It takes you back to where you started in life, because a lot of people sometimes, when you reach a certain level, you kind of forget what the values were. So I think these values are very important.
So don't forget where you started in life,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
So Kumar.
Piyush, I think we're saying the same thing. Ethics and values are the ones you can carry. I can only suggest to students that that is the most important issue. And you were saying about giving to the community. You're not giving to the community because you want to give it up. You're giving it because you're going to get it back again. So that's right.
Right. Manor?
I think the question you have to ask is, are you going to be a deal maker or a businessman? If you are going to be a businessman, it has to be anchored on values and culture. And culture eats strategy for breakfast. You can copy strategy, you cannot copy culture. So that's critical for sustainability of business.
All right, Siddharth, you're the last word.
Yeah, I think honestly, to run a successful business, you got to have more than just a dream. You got to have the, this differentiating factor. You got to have the value system. You got to have the delivery model. You got to make up on a lot of things. It's not just one single factor. It's a combination of things.
All right. We've run out of time. So let me wind up on this note by saying first, I'm actually very encouraged by the fact that we have on this panel a bunch of captains of industry who don't represent generational wealth, who don't represent business houses that have been around for long periods of time. The people who made a mark in recent times and they're making an impact. And if they're representative of the new breed of captains of industry on the subcontinent, I think the future is actually quite bright. Now, if only they would get together and create a business forum that works, we would all be much happier. Please join me in giving them a round of applause.